Havenport was a speck of a town clinging to the rugged cliffs of England's southwestern coast, a place where the future and the past seemed to tangle like seaweed on the shore. It was the year 2075, and though drones buzzed lazily over the docks delivering supplies and holographic billboards flickered with weather updates, the cobblestone streets and salt-worn cottages held fast to a stubborn, old-world charm. The locals liked it that way, quiet, predictable, a refuge from the sprawling tech cities inland. But beneath the calm, Havenport carried a shadow, a murmur of unease that surfaced in hushed tales at the pub, people vanishing without a trace, not just once, but over decades, their names fading from memory as if they'd never existed. No one spoke of it much, not out loud, but the weight of those absences hung in the air like the fog that rolled in each night. Luna, a 5-year-old Labrador Retriever with a coat the color of warm honey, didn't care much for ghost stories. Her world was simpler, long walks along the cliffs with her human, the crackle of the fireplace in their stone cottage, the occasional treat slipped from a gnarled hand. That human was Eleanor Grayson, 68, a woman with silver hair cropped short and eyes that carried the sharpness of a mind once feared in boardrooms. She'd been a scientist, a pioneer in quantum tech for a corporation called Next-Tech, until she'd walked away 20 years ago, trading sterile labs for this windswept nowhere. Havenport suited her, or so she told herself, and Luna, with her boundless energy and quiet loyalty, had become the anchor she hadn't known she needed. It was a Tuesday night in late October when the fog came thicker than usual, a gray shroud that swallowed the cliffs and muffled the crash of waves below. Eleanor sat by the hearth, a cup of tea cooling in her hands, her gaze lost in the flames. Luna sprawled at her feet, her tail thumping lazily against the rug, until a faint hum broke the stillness, a sound too low for Eleanor's aging ears, but sharp enough to snap Luna upright. The dog's ears perked, her head tilting toward the window, and a low whine rumbled in her throat. "What is it, girl?" Eleanor asked, setting the cup down, her voice rough from disuse. Luna didn't answer, not in words, but padded to the back door, her nose twitching, her whine growing insistent. Eleanor followed, pulling a shawl around her shoulders, and opened the door to a wall of mist. The garden beyond was a blur, the roses she'd planted last spring reduced to vague shapes, but Luna didn't hesitate. She darted out, her paws sinking into the damp earth, and began to dig near the old oak that marked the edge of their lot, a frantic, focused scrabble that sent dirt flying. "Luna, stop that!" Eleanor called, stepping onto the porch, but the dog ignored her, her tail wagging like a metronome. A moment later, Luna's jaws closed around something, and she trotted back, dropping her prize at Eleanor's feet with a proud huff. It was a sphere, no bigger than a tennis ball, its surface a dull, tarnished silver etched with hairline cracks. Faint lights pulsed beneath its skin, blue, then red, then blue again, like a heartbeat struggling to wake. Eleanor frowned, crouching stiffly to pick it up, the cold metal biting into her palm. A hum vibrated through her fingers, subtle but undeniable, and Luna whined again, her eyes fixed on the object with an intensity Eleanor hadn't seen before. "Where did you find this?" she muttered, turning it over, her mind ticking through possibilities, some kid's toy, a lost drone part, a piece of junk washed up from the sea. But something about it tugged at her, a memory buried deep, sharp-edged and unwelcome. She carried it inside, Luna trailing close, and set it on the kitchen table under the harsh glare of a lamp. The sphere's hum grew louder, a frequency that prickled the air, and Luna paced, her nails clicking against the stone floor. Eleanor's hands hesitated, then brushed a faint seam along its equator, and with a soft click, it split open, revealing a nest of circuits and a tiny screen flickering to life. Numbers scrolled across it, codes, coordinates, names, too fast to read, but one caught her eye before it vanished, Subject 17, terminated, 2055. Her breath stopped, her chest tightening as if the room had shrunk around her. 2055, the year she'd left Next-Tech. The year of the Echo Shift project, a name she'd buried with her career, a failure she'd sworn never to unearth. Luna barked, sharp and urgent, snapping Eleanor from her daze, and the sphere's hum spiked, a sound that wasn't just sound but a call, threading through the fog outside. Eleanor stared at it, then at Luna, whose amber eyes gleamed with a knowing she couldn't explain. "What have you gotten us into, girl?" she whispered, her voice trembling, not with fear but with the dawning certainty that Havenport's shadows were waking, and they'd found her, through the one companion she'd never doubted. The sphere sat on Eleanor's kitchen table like an uninvited guest, its faint hum weaving through the stillness of the cottage, a thread of sound that Luna couldn't ignore. The Labrador Retriever paced restlessly, her tail low, her ears twitching with every pulse of light from the device, blue, red, blue again, a rhythm that seemed to call her. Eleanor watched her, the weight of the sphere's cracked shell heavy in her mind, the flickering name, Subject 17, terminated, 2055, burning behind her eyes. She'd spent 2 decades burying that year, the year Nextech's Echo Shift project had collapsed under whispers of failure and hushed-up disasters. A quantum teleportation experiment, they'd called it, a leap toward instant travel, a future where distance meant nothing. But something had gone wrong, terribly wrong, and she'd walked away, leaving the wreckage behind. Or so she'd thought. Luna stopped pacing, her nose nudging the sphere, a low growl rumbling in her chest. "Easy, girl," Eleanor said, reaching for it, but the dog's amber eyes locked onto hers, sharp with purpose, and she darted to the back door again, scratching at the wood. Eleanor sighed, her joints protesting as she stood, and grabbed a flashlight from the counter, its beam stronger than the dim lamp overhead. "All right, you win," she muttered, pulling on a coat and slipping the sphere into her pocket. The hum vibrated against her hip, a reminder that whatever Luna sensed, it wasn't finished with them. Outside, the fog clung to Havenport like a second skin, the cliffs and cottages fading into a gray haze. Luna led the way, her golden coat a beacon in the murk, her nose low to the ground as she followed an invisible trail. Eleanor trailed behind, her boots crunching on gravel, the flashlight cutting a narrow path through the mist. The town was silent, its residents tucked away from the damp, but the air felt alive, charged with a tension she couldn't name. Luna veered off the main road, past the shuttered bakery in the old pier, toward the boneyard of Havenport's fishing days, a stretch of shore littered with rusted hulls and splintered docks, abandoned since the drones took over the trade. The sphere's hum grew louder as they neared a crumbling jetty, its wooden planks sagging into the sea. Luna stopped, her ears flat, and barked, a sharp, insistent sound that echoed off the water. Eleanor caught up, her breath fogging in the cold, and aimed the flashlight at the jetty's base, where the tide lapped against barnacle-crusted pilings. The sphere pulsed in her pocket, its lights flashing faster, and she pulled it out, the tiny screen flickering with new data, Signal Point 1, active, October 23, 2055. Her stomach twisted. October 23, 2055, the day Echo Shift's final test had gone silent, the day she'd resigned. "Luna, what's out there?" she asked, her voice tight, but the dog was already moving, leaping onto the jetty with a grace that belied her size. Eleanor followed, the boards creaking under her weight, the sea's salt tang sharp in her nose. Halfway across, Luna stopped again, her nose sniffing the air, and pawed at a loose plank. Eleanor knelt, wincing as her knees pressed into the damp wood, and pried it up with the flashlight's edge. Beneath was a hollow space, a rusted metal box wedged between the pilings, its lid scratched with the Nextech logo, a stylized N she'd once worn on her lab coat. Her hands trembled as she pulled it free, the sphere's hum spiking into a shrill whine that made Luna whimper. Inside the box was a tangle of wires, a cracked data pad, and a single sheet of plastipaper, its text faded but legible, Echo Shift Log, Havenport Site. Subject 17, Margaret Poole, 32, volunteer. Status, displaced. Signal lost. Eleanor's throat closed. Margaret Poole, a name she hadn't heard in years, a bright-eyed tech who'd believed in the project more than she had. Displaced. Not terminated, but lost, a word Nextech had used to soften the truth, to hide what they couldn't fix. Luna barked again, louder, her head snapping toward the shore, and Eleanor followed her gaze. Through the fog, a shadow moved, not a person, not quite, but a flicker, a distortion in the air like heat rising off pavement. The sphere's screen flashed, signal detected, subject 17, and the shadow pulsed, faint but growing, a shape that might have been a woman, there and gone in a heartbeat. Eleanor stumbled back, the box slipping from her hands, its contents scattering across the jetty. "Margaret," she whispered, her voice swallowed by the wind, but the shadow didn't return. Luna growled, her hackles up, and nosed the data pad, its screen cracked but glowing faintly. Eleanor picked it up, her fingers smudging the grime, and tapped it awake. A list appeared, names, dates, coordinates, all tied to Havenport, all from 2055, subject 18, Thomas Reed, subject 19, Clara Henshaw, subject 20, Daniel Bryce. 20 names, 20 signals, 20 people erased from the town's memory, their lives snuffed out by a project she'd helped build. Luna whined, pressing against her leg, and Eleanor felt the weight of it, the guilt she'd buried, the lives she'd let slip away. "We need to go back," she said, her voice firm despite the shake in her hands, gathering the box's contents and shoving them into her coat. But Luna didn't move toward home. She turned inland, toward the old cannery, a hulking shell of corrugated steel on the edge of town, its windows dark and shattered. The sphere pulsed again, its hum a beacon, and Luna took off, her paws pounding the earth, leaving Eleanor no choice but to follow. The fog thickened, the town fading behind them, and as they neared the cannery, the air buzzed, alive with whispers too faint to catch, names, pleas, echoes of the lost, calling through the night. The cannery loomed through the fog like a forgotten giant, its rusted steel walls streaked with decades of salt and neglect, its jagged roofline cutting into the gray sky. Havenport's fishing industry had died long before Eleanor arrived, leaving this hulking relic to rot on the town's edge, a skeleton of an era no one mourned. But tonight, it pulsed with a life it shouldn't have, faint vibrations rippling through the ground, a hum that matched the sphere in Eleanor's pocket, growing louder with every step Luna took. The Labrador Retriever bounded ahead, her golden fur dulled by the mist, her ears flat against her head as she navigated the overgrown path to the cannery's gaping entrance. Eleanor followed, her flashlight beam trembling slightly, the weight of the box's contents, data pad, plastipaper, wires, pressing against her chest like a confession she couldn't outrun. "Luna, slow down," she called, her voice hoarse, swallowed by the wind whistling through the broken windows above. But Luna didn't slow, she slipped through the entrance, her paws echoing on the concrete floor, and barked, a sharp, urgent sound that pulled Eleanor inside. The air was thick with damp rot and the faint tang of metal, the cavernous space stretching out in shadows pierced only by her flashlight. Old machinery rusted in corners, conveyors, gutting tables, a tangle of pipes, relics of a time when Havenport thrived. But Luna ignored them, her nose low, her tail stiff, leading Eleanor deeper, past crumbling crates to a steel door at the back, its surface scratched and dented, a faded authorized personnel-only sign peeling above it. The sphere's hum spiked as they approached, a shrill whine that made Eleanor's teeth ache, and Luna pawed at the door, her nails scraping metal with a sound that set her nerves on edge. "All right, girl, I'm here," Eleanor muttered, shoving the flashlight under her arm and pulling the door's rusted handle. It resisted, groaning under her weight, until it gave way with a screech, revealing a narrow stairwell descending into darkness. The air that wafted up was colder, heavier, laced with a metallic bitterness she recognized, ozone, the scent of active tech, not the decay of abandonment. Luna didn't hesitate, bounding down the steps, and Eleanor followed, her heart thudding against her ribs, the data pad clutched tight in her free hand. The stairs ended in a basement, a concrete chamber lit by faint, flickering strips along the ceiling, emergency lights that shouldn't still work, powered by some unseen source. The room was small, claustrophobic, its walls lined with dusty consoles and cracked screens, a remnant of a lab Nex-Tech had never admitted to building. In the center stood a machine, a squat, cylindrical device, its surface studded with blinking nodes, its top crowned with a dish-like emitter pulsing faintly blue. Eleanor froze, her breath catching. She knew it, an echo shift relay, a prototype meant to anchor test subjects during teleportation, to keep them from displacing. She'd designed its failsafe herself, a lifetime ago. Luna circled the machine, growling low, her hackles up as she sniffed the air. The sphere in Eleanor's pocket buzzed, its screen flashing, signal point 2, active, subject 18 to 20 detected. She pulled it out, her fingers trembling as the list from the jetty reappeared: Thomas Reed, Clara Henshaw, Daniel Bryce, names of the lost, their signals converging here. "They're here," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but Luna barked in response, her head snapping toward a shadowed corner where the wall met the floor. Eleanor aimed the flashlight, its beam catching a pile of debris, broken pipes, shattered glass, until it glinted on something else, a hatch, flush with the concrete, its edges sealed with rust but marked by faint scratches, as if something had clawed at it from below. Luna lunged, her paws scrabbling at the hatch, and Eleanor dropped to her knees beside her, the data pad slipping to the floor as she searched for a latch. Her fingers found a recessed handle, cold and gritty, and she yanked, the hatch groaning open with a puff of stale air. Below was a shallow pit, a maintenance crawlspace, its dirt floor littered with fragments, cloth, metal, bone, and at its center, a tangle of wires pulsing with the same blue light as the relay above. Luna whined, her nose twitching, and Eleanor leaned in, her flashlight revealing a shape half buried in the dirt, a skeletal hand, its fingers curled around a cracked badge, the Nextech logo still visible. Her stomach lurched, bile rising in her throat, but she forced herself to look closer. Beside the hand was a data chip, its casing scorched but intact, and she pried it free, her hands shaking as she plugged it into the data pad. The screen flared, static crackling before resolving into a grainy recording, a voice, panicked, cutting through the hum: "This is Thomas Reed, subject 18. It's October 25, 2055. The relay failed, Clara's gone, Daniel's fading. I'm stuck, between. If anyone finds this, tell them it wasn't an accident." Morrow knew. The audio cut off, swallowed by a burst of noise, leaving Eleanor staring at the blank screen, the name Morrow echoing in her skull. Henry Morrow, her old supervisor at Nextech, a cold, ambitious man who'd pushed Echo Shift past its limits, ignored her warnings, silenced dissent. She'd thought he'd died in obscurity after the project folded, but if Thomas's words were true, Morrow had known the relay would fail, had let it fail, trapping 20 souls in a limbo she'd helped create. Luna pressed against her, a warm weight against the chill, and Eleanor gripped the data pad, her mind racing. "He knew," she said, her voice hard, the guilt she'd carried sharpening into anger. "And he left them here." The relay pulsed louder, its emitter flaring, and the air shimmered, a distortion, like the shadow at the jetty, but clearer now, a man, faint and flickering, his face gaunt, his eyes wide with terror. "Help," he mouthed, no sound escaping, and Luna barked, leaping toward him, her paws passing through the image as it dissolved. The sphere's screen flashed, subject 18, signal weakening. Eleanor stood, her knees trembling, and looked at Luna, whose amber eyes gleamed with a resolve she couldn't match. "We can't leave them," she said, her voice firm despite the dread clawing at her chest. "Not like this." She turned to the relay, its controls dusty but familiar, and began to work, her fingers tracing circuits she'd designed decades ago. Luna stayed close, her growls a steady rhythm against the machine's hum, guiding Eleanor through the dark as the cannery's secrets unraveled, one lost soul at a time. The cannery basement thrummed with the relay's pulse, a heartbeat of blue light that cast jagged shadows across the concrete walls, illuminating the skeletal hand in the pit below like a grim sentinel. Eleanor's fingers flew over the machine's controls, tracing circuits she'd designed in another life, her mind racing to bridge the gap between memory and necessity. The sphere in her pocket buzzed incessantly, its screen flashing: subject 20, signal critical, Daniel Bryce, the last name on the list, the final thread of Echo Shift's failure. Luna paced beside her, her growls a steady counterpoint to the relay's hum, her amber eyes darting to the shimmering air where Thomas Reed's image had flickered and faded. The Labrador Retriever's instincts had led them this far, through fog and ruins, past bones and ghosts, and Eleanor trusted her now, more than the tech she'd once believed in. "Hold on, Daniel," she muttered, her voice rough, her hands steadying as she bypassed a fried relay node, rerouting power to the emitter dish. The machine whined, a high-pitched keen that made Luna's ears flatten, but Eleanor pressed on, her flashlight propped against a console, its beam cutting through the dust. The data pad lay open beside her, Thomas's recording looping in her head. Morrow knew, a condemnation that fueled her, sharpened her focus. Henry Morrow had buried them, but she wouldn't let it end here, not with Luna's unwavering presence urging her forward. The relay flared, its emitter glowing brighter, and the air crackled, a rift forming, a tear in the fabric of the room, shimmering like liquid glass. Luna barked, sharp and loud, her hackles up as the rift widened, revealing not the cannery's walls but a void, a gray expanse streaked with faint, shifting shapes. Eleanor's breath caught, her hands freezing on the controls. She'd seen this before, in simulations, Echo Shift's transit space, a theoretical between place where matter hung before reassembly. But this wasn't theory. This was real, and something moved within it, a figure, faint but growing clearer, stumbling through the haze. "Luna, stay back," Eleanor warned, but the dog lunged, her paws skidding on the concrete as she leaped toward the rift, her bark echoing into the void. The sphere's hum spiked, a deafening screech, and the rift pulsed, sucking air from the room with a force that yanked Eleanor forward. She grabbed the console, her nails digging into metal, but Luna was caught, her body lifting off the ground, pulled into the gray. "No!" Eleanor shouted, diving after her, her coat snagging on the relay as she tumbled through the rift, the world dissolving around her. She landed hard, her knees slamming into a surface that wasn't concrete but something softer, shifting, like sand under a thin crust. The air was thick, heavy with a metallic tang, and the gray stretched endlessly, broken only by faint outlines, trees, buildings, faces, flickering like mirages. Luna stood a few yards away, shaking her head, her golden fur matted with a strange, clinging dust. She barked, softer now, her ears twitching as she scanned the void, and Eleanor staggered to her feet, the sphere still buzzing in her pocket, its screen dark but warm against her hip. "Luna, you're all right," she breathed, relief flooding her as she reached the dog, her hands sinking into Luna's fur, grounding her in this unreal place. A sound cut through the haze, a groan, low and pained, coming from deeper in the gray. Luna's head snapped toward it, her growl returning, and she took off, her paws kicking up plumes of dust. Eleanor followed, her legs unsteady on the shifting ground, her flashlight lost in the fall but the sphere's faint glow guiding her. The shapes grew sharper as they moved, fractured glimpses of Havenport, a warped pier, a twisted cannery, echoes of the real world bleeding into this limbo. Then she saw him, a man, crumpled against a jagged outcrop of what might have been stone, his clothes tattered, his face gaunt but alive. "Daniel?" Eleanor called, her voice echoing oddly, bouncing back in fragments. He stirred, his head lifting, eyes wide and bloodshot, staring through her as if she weren't there. "Miles," he rasped, correcting her, his voice a dry whisper. "Miles Dawson. Not Bryce. Bryce is gone." Eleanor's chest tightened. Miles Dawson, Subject 20, the last signal, a name she hadn't known until now. Luna approached him, her nose sniffing cautiously, then licked his hand, a gentle nudge that brought a flicker of focus to his gaze. "You're real," he murmured, his fingers brushing Luna's fur, clinging to her like a lifeline. "We're getting you out," Eleanor said, kneeling beside him, her mind racing to piece together the relay's mechanics from this side. She pulled the sphere from her pocket, its hum weaker now, its screen cracked but flickering, signal locked, Subject 20. Luna found you. She's been finding all of you. Miles nodded faintly, his breath shallow, and pointed a trembling hand toward a pulsing light in the distance, a blue beacon cutting through the gray, the relay's echo in this space. It's holding me, he said, coughing, dust spilling from his lips. 20 years, stuck here. Morrow, he locked it. Said we'd ruin him. Eleanor's jaw clenched, the name a fresh wound. Morrow hadn't just known, he'd sabotaged them, trapped them here to save his reputation, his career. She stood, helping Miles to his feet, his weight leaning heavily on her shoulder. Luna, lead us, she commanded, and the dog bounded toward the light, her barks ringing out, a tether in the chaos. The ground shifted beneath them, cracking and tilting, the mirages warping, faces of the lost, Thomas, Clara, Daniel, pleading silently as the void fought to keep its prize. Eleanor stumbled, Miles nearly slipping from her grip, but Luna circled back, her teeth tugging at Eleanor's coat, pulling her forward. The beacon grew brighter, a swirling portal of blue, and Eleanor felt the sphere heat in her hand, its hum syncing with the relay's pulse. We're close, she gasped, her lungs burning, the air thinning as they neared the edge. The portal flared, and Luna leaped through, vanishing into the light. Eleanor tightened her hold on Miles, his frail form trembling, and followed, the void clawing at them as they crossed. A jolt of static ripped through her, a scream caught in her throat, and then she hit concrete, the cannery basement snapping back into focus. Luna stood beside her, barking furiously, and Miles collapsed, coughing but breathing, alive. The relay sparked, its emitter dimming, and the rift collapsed with a final, shuddering groan, the hum fading to silence. Eleanor sank to her knees, her hands shaking as she clutched the sphere, its screen blank now, its purpose spent. Luna pressed against her, warm and solid, her tail wagging faintly despite the dust clinging to her fur. Miles groaned, his eyes fluttering open, staring at the ceiling as if seeing it for the first time. Out, he whispered, a ghost of a smile cracking his lips. I'm out. The cannery was still, the air heavy with the aftermath, but Eleanor felt the weight of it, the lives she couldn't save, the ones Luna had pulled her toward. Morrow's betrayal burned, but Luna's loyalty, her unyielding drive, had torn through the dark. They'd found Miles, defied the void, and as the relay sputtered its last, Eleanor knew this wasn't over, not yet. The cannery basement fell silent, the relay's final sputter fading into a stillness that pressed against Eleanor's ears, heavy and absolute. The air smelled of scorched metal and dust, the faint blue glow of the machine extinguished, its emitter dish cracked and lifeless. Luna stood beside her, panting softly, her golden fur streaked with grime from the transit space, her amber eyes fixed on Miles Dawson as he lay sprawled on the concrete, his chest rising and falling with shallow, ragged breaths. Eleanor knelt next to him, her hands trembling as she checked his pulse, weak, erratic, but there. He was alive, pulled from the void by Luna's relentless drive, a miracle she hadn't dared hope for after 20 years of silence. Luna, you did it, she whispered, her voice cracking as she ran a hand over the Labrador Retriever's head, feeling the warmth of her fur against her cold fingers. Luna leaned into the touch, her tail giving a faint wag, a quiet acknowledgement of their victory. Miles stirred, his eyes fluttering open, and coughed, a dry, hacking sound that echoed in the empty space. Water, he rasped, and Eleanor fumbled in her coat, finding a small flask she'd carried from home. She tipped it to his lips, steadying his head as he drank, his gaunt face softening with each sip. You're safe now, she said, her tone firm despite the exhaustion pulling at her limbs. We got you out. Miles nodded weakly, his gaze drifting to Luna, a flicker of gratitude breaking through the haze of his ordeal. Dog, saved me, he murmured, his voice barely audible, and Eleanor smiled, a tight, bittersweet curve of her lips. She saved us both. The sphere lay discarded beside her, its screen dark, its hum gone, a relic of a past she could no longer bury. Eleanor picked it up, turning it over in her hands, the weight of its secrets settling into her bones. Thomas Reed's recording, the list of names, Morrow's betrayal, they'd unraveled Echo Shift's truth, piece by jagged piece, and Luna had been the thread tying it together. But the relay was dead, its connection to the transit space severed, and the other 19, Margaret, Thomas, Clara, Daniel, were lost forever, their signals snuffed out in the void. She'd saved one, but the rest haunted her, a debt she'd carry beyond this night. Miles coughed again, stronger now, and pushed himself up, leaning against the relay's base. "Morrow," he said, his voice gaining edge, "he came down here, after it failed. Locked the controls, said we'd expose him, ruin next tech. Left us, to fade." Eleanor's jaw tightened, her fingers curling around the sphere. She'd suspected as much, but hearing it from Miles, a survivor of Morrow's cowardice, turned her guilt into a cold, simmering rage. "He's gone," she said, her tone flat. "Died years ago. But I should have known, should have stopped him." "You didn't know," Miles replied, his eyes meeting hers, sharp despite his frailty. "None of us did. Not until it was too late." He reached out, his hand brushing Luna's fur again, and she nuzzled him, a quiet comfort in the dark. Eleanor watched them, the anger softening into something heavier, responsibility, not just for what she'd done, but for what she could still do. She stood, helping Miles to his feet, his weight a burden she bore with Luna's steady presence at her side. "We need to get you out of here," she said, glancing at the stairwell, the faint flicker of emergency lights guiding their path. The cannery creaked above, the wind rattling its bones, but the fog outside had lifted, the first gray light of dawn creeping through the broken windows as they climbed. Luna led the way, her paws sure on the steps, her barks echoing with a purpose that pulled them forward. Eleanor's mind churned. Miles needed medical care, a story to tell the town, a way to make this right, but first, they needed home. The cottage welcomed them with its familiar warmth, the hearth still glowing from the night before. Eleanor settled Miles on the couch, wrapping him in a blanket, and called Havenport's lone clinic, her voice steady as she explained a lost hiker found in the cannery, sidestepping the truth for now. Luna curled up beside him, her head resting on his lap, a guardian keeping watch as his breathing evened out. Eleanor sank into a chair, the sphere and data pad on the table before her, and stared at them, the weight of the night pressing down. Hours later, after the clinic took Miles away, promising tests, questions, a slow recovery, Eleanor sat alone with Luna, the morning sun filtering through the windows, casting long shadows across the stone floor. She'd saved him, but the cost lingered, the 19 others, the years she'd spent blind to Morrow's sabotage, the lives erased by a project she'd helped birth. Luna nudged her hand, a soft whine breaking her reverie, and Eleanor looked down, meeting those amber eyes that had never wavered. "You knew," she said, her voice soft, a confession. "From that first hum, you knew something was wrong. I should have listened sooner, to you, to myself." Luna tilted her head, her tail thumping against the rug, and Eleanor felt a lesson take root, sharp and clear. The past couldn't be undone, but it could be faced, and sometimes it took a friend, furry or not, to show the way. Morrow had run from his mistakes, locked them away, but Luna had dug them up, forced her to see, to act. Loyalty, she realized, wasn't just love, it was courage, the kind that pulled you through the dark when you'd rather look away. She stood, gathering the sphere and data pad, and walked to her desk, pulling out a recorder she hadn't touched in years. "This is Eleanor Grayson," she began, her voice steady, October 27, 2075. "What follows is the truth about Echo Shift, Havenport, and the 20 lives it claimed. Henry Morrow sabotaged it. I was complicit. Miles Dawson survived because of Luna, my dog, who wouldn't let it stay buried." She paused, glancing at Luna, who watched her with quiet trust. "This is for the record, for them." The recording would go to the authorities, to historians, to anyone who'd listen, not to absolve her, but to honor the lost, to ensure Morrow's shadow didn't swallow their names again. Havenport would forget, as it always had, but Eleanor wouldn't. She'd live with it, learn from it, and Luna would be there, her steady heartbeat a reminder that even in failure, there was redemption, if you were brave enough to seek it. Outside, the creek murmured, the cliffs stood silent, and Luna stretched out by the hearth, her eyes closing in the warmth. Eleanor joined her, her hand resting on the dog's back, and together they watched the sun rise, a new day born from the ashes of the old.